As we start a new year, I think about life, what is life, and how we can enhance life. You know, you make New Year's resolutions to make your life better or to open your life. And at a dark time of year, its relation to light, etc. So I was reflecting on that theme. I thought I'd speak about it. All the more so, it turns out, because yesterday morning, in fact, as I was celebrating Mass, I got a call from, I found out that one of my close high school friends had suddenly died after a brief but serious illness. So, as Zen reminds us, and all spirituality reminds us, life is precarious and life is fragile and life is ephemeral, so we should understand what it is and how we can enhance it and how we can let it, carry us. So actually to understand life philosophically, I thought I'd go back to something that in my early monastic days, when I was a Carthusian novice in my early 20s, the discovery of what Thomas Aquinas, of all people, had to say about life and what it is, based on Aristotle and on, Christian theology. It fascinated and captivated and enthralled me at the time. I remember sharing it with this older retreatant on one of our monastic walks, and I don't know what he thought about it, but he thought it was very, very interesting. But anyway, but it does illuminate, what life really is, and then we can see how it fits in with Zen and with Christian spirituality too. So I went back to where I found it in St. Thomas' second most famous work called the Summa Contra Gentiles, which, and I found it where I remembered it, the fourth book, 11th chapter. So I went up to the top shelf with my bookshelf with dusty old tomes, St. Thomas are, and pulled it down and got myself all dusty. Literally. But there it was, and he's discussing how to understand philosophically the generation of the Word from the Father in Trinitarian theology, starting with Aristotle, of all people. Well, you'll see for yourself. But whether you're Christian or not, you can follow the wisdom and the insight from Aristotle and from Thomas. So he goes through the scale of being. And so he says you start with stones and inanimate, in other words, things that aren't alive by our customary reckoning. And he says there's no, well, let me share what his basic definition of life is, philosophically and even scientifically, is immanent, self-perfecting activities. So it's something that's going on inside, immanent, and it's self-perfecting. So it's towards growth, which is already interesting from a spiritual point of view. It's interior, and it's growth. So he says, with stones and inanimate objects, they're not alive because there's no inner life, perceptibly, and no growth. Of course, today, scientifically, we know that there's a lot of movement atomically, if not anatomically, atomically in stones. But still, the definition basically holds that he says the main interaction between inanimate objects is just striking each other or knocking each other around. So interesting. So when you get to the level of plants, well, so you're getting nourishment from below, from outside. But there's immanent activity going on because there's growth, or as Aristotle points out, growth, nutrition, and reproduction. The three characteristics of living beings is growth, nutrition, growth, and reproduction. So you can see that in plants, that there's an enhancement of life, there's growth, there's nourishment, and then there's reproduction, self-expression, and you might even say gift of self in the production of seeds or fruit. Now he says when you get to animals, sentient beings, there's also, activity of imagination, sense, perception, and imagination. Even animals dream and have images. So there's more interior. There's more of an expression that's within, that doesn't just go outside. But that also happens with reproduction, of course, in animals. So when you get to humans, there's nourishment, growth, reproduction physically also, as in previous instances. But there's also an inner life, which is based on sense perception, but then imagery, and then thought and word. So as an abstraction, there's concepts and there's expression of a word outside. But the word is just hot air, literally. But there's more of an inner life, and that self-perfecting activity is not just growth or reproduction, but is thought and art and science and interior activity, intellectual activity. And then you can apply that, as he does, to the angelic world, where there's everything is interior. Understanding is interior, and the concepts are richer and broader. Little we know of the angelic world. But where he goes with this is that he shows that with God, God's being and God's intellect and all are one. So the word that's produced is living, exists. It's not just hot air. And that's what we call the Word of God and the Son of God. So Thomas basically attempts to prove the Trinity from Aristotle, which is amazing. Because if you follow the logic, it makes perfect sense. So you can see why I was captivated by it. But for our present purposes, what you see is that there's a dynamic of interiority and growth, expansion, physically and otherwise, mentally and emotionally, you might say, of soul, and then reproduction, not just physically, but passing on wisdom, passing on life, passing on light to others. And that's certainly what we see in God, what God does with His Word. Let there be light, creation of the whole world. And one of the things I meditated on a lot back in those days, before I was wise, maybe I've never become wise, but in those days I was wondering, is it more self-expression or self-gift? Even in physical reproduction, is it self-expression or self-gift? And then, of course, in higher sharing, is it like in art, is it just self-expression or is it self-giving? Well, of course, I realize now. No, it's gift itself. You express yourself by giving. It's a giving, and that is your self-expression. You can say the same thing in God, in Christian terms. So you see what we're talking about life here, and this goes beyond philosophy, beyond Christianity, beyond. It's about an inner life that expands and grows and opens and shares and gives, and that's what life is on all these possible levels that you can imagine. But the higher up you go, the richer it is. So when we say, for example, that the ultimate reality, whatever you want to call it, is life, that's what we mean. When we say it's light, that's what we mean, which grows, expands, and shares. Let there be light, Aristotle himself said, I remember this quote, Thomas Aquinas quotes Aristotle's quote, and he says, the being of something is quodam lumen ipsius, which means is a sort of light of the thing. So being itself is luminous and radiant, and it follows this logic, dynamic of life, which is expansion and sharing and pouring out. That's the very nature of light, which is diffusive of itself. But that's also what love is and what compassion is. It's expansion, sharing, luminosity, pouring out. So light, life, and love, especially in ultimate reality, are the same. And the closer we come to that absolute reality, the more we are expansive and sharing and luminous and loving. Makes perfect sense. But we need to experience that. But that's the great logic of it. And I was thinking today, the Zen circle. The Zen circle, which is just I've given teishos on the circle symbolism before. The white, the black, the absolute, the relative. But it's circular. Do you notice? All of reality is a circle. As many mystics have said, the ultimate reality is a circle whose center is everywhere and circumference is nowhere. All of reality is just a circle. But it's a dynamic circle. It's not a stationary circle. This infinite circle, as Roshi Bernard Glassman calls it, the ultimate Zen circle, is dynamic. Or as Masao Abe says, it's a dynamic shunyata, it's a dynamic emptiness, the absolute and the relative together. The absolute goes into the relative, and the relative goes into the absolute. Emptiness is form, and form is emptiness, and it's all one, but it's dynamic. It's a sharing, and it's expansion. It's in movement from the absolute to the relative, and the relative back to the absolute, back again, interiorly or exteriorly or whatever, because in the end there's no interior or exterior, it's all one. But that's the dynamic. That should be our New Year's resolution, to love and radiate and expand and live, in that dimension, in this dimension, which embraces everything in that circle. And that circle is the dance, in Christian terms, of the Trinity. Father into the Son and the Holy Spirit, and mirrored in the world and shared in the world, ecstatically in the world. That's what we should be sharing in and we should be open to. So I want to close with, again, Beatrice Brutto, whom I've quoted before in my teishos, God's ecstasy, the creation of a self-creating world. And you see where we're going with this. The absolute ecstatically enters in and shares and pours out, but then the relative mirrors that, shares in that, and does the same thing, the self-creating world, the expansion, the radiation, the sharing, the radiance and the sharing. And you can take it from either side, coming from the absolute to the relative, more masculine, and the relative to the absolute is like a giving birth. It's like a new life. It's almost more feminine if you want to take it in Taoist terms almost, the yin and the yang. But I'll just quote, and this of course is from a Christian perspective, but it's based on her experience of Hinduism and of Eastern thought as well, that she takes it as like the incarnation, and you can see in my homily for Christmas Day, I talk about this, that there's the expression of the absolute in the relative, which we call incarnation in Christianity. And then she says the other one is the Theotokos, which is the God-bearer, which, as she says, is applied to the Virgin Mary, whose feast was yesterday, and which is about giving birth. So that's the Christian word for the absolute passing to the relative, incarnation, and the relative going back to the absolute, the Theotokos, the God-bearer, in which we're all called to be. We're all the incarnation in a deep sense, as everything is, and we're all the bearer, the God-bearer. That's Christopher, that's what it means, So she says, and she explains that she uses both of those terms. And so she says it's the model of the Trinity. It's like the life cycle, it says, where, the first person, or the poise, the place, is the purely transcendent aspect, the absolute, we would say. The infinite, the absolute, the creator. The second one, the poise, is the incarnation, the transcendent divine community becoming incarnate in the cosmos, the creator in the created, the infinite and the invisible being manifested as finite and visible. And she quotes, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us," was what we've been celebrating as Christians these past days. Third person, or the poise, is the gift or emergence of spirit from the incarnation, or from the Theotokos, if you will. God, or the Absolute, empties God's self and takes form in matter. The material cosmos evolves until it becomes self-conscious, that level of life that we're talking about, realizes that it's being created by God, the union of matter and spirit, and the emergence of the spiritual from the interactions with the material. The self-conscious, God-conscious cosmos goes on to realize that it is being created by God precisely as an image, a self-creating cosmic community, expanding, and thus it is God's beloved child and delight. This is the birth of God in and from matter, and the uniting of the incarnate and cosmic to the transcendent, the contemplative's goal, and completes the cycle. The Zen circle. And our cosmic dance. So she has some wonderful questions and reflections there, but then she concludes by saying, if we think of ourselves as such persons, contemplatives, we shouldn't ignore or neglect or withdraw ourselves from this marvelous world where God is living and creating. We should study and strive to understand it so that we can really live in it. Her emphasis. Live in it with God. That's a good New Year's revolution. Revolution and resolution to be truly alive.